very happy to be here. I'm delighted. And as long as I've been at BC, I find the opportunities that I've had as a faculty member to chat in this way have been few. And not that there aren't plenty of conversations, spontaneous conversations, but kind of making the time to do that isn't the norm, and partly because we're all so buried in the work that we're doing, which is a good thing, and partly because I think these things, unless they're intentional, we sort of just leave them. My intention is not to give you my life story. If I were 30, it wouldn't take too long. At this stage of the game, I'm happy not to do that. But what I would love to do is elaborate on the big ideas that connect my work as a faculty member here, in particular my work as a researcher, to my faith, which in my case happens to be Catholic. So I'm happy to share how I make those connections, and also to share with you a little bit some of the sources of inspiration for me along the way. And some of those, well, I'll let them speak for themselves, but the things that have really moved me. And as I was thinking about this over the week, I reached in my den to this table. You know, everybody has a table that's always full of their reading or their special stuff, and at the bottom of one of these piles, I have the really special stuff. I said to my husband this week, look, when I die, the stuff I really care about is at the bottom of this pile. And what it is are some of the pieces that have inspired me, other people's writings, things, interviews, but poems sometimes, but things that really have kind of charged up my soul in the process of living as a psychologist and as a person working in a university and engaging in research. Without giving you the long saga of my life, I will tell you just a little bit about the context of how I grew up so that you'll get a sense. I came from Boston, obviously, and actually Brighton, so pretty close. And I saw BC over the years grow from, you know, a much smaller place to what it is today. But my parents were immigrants, and there were, as I thought about it for this, there were three kind of critical learnings that I took away from that experience. My parents were faithful. They were Catholics, believing, practicing Catholics. But as I grew, I came to realize that they made a pretty clear distinction between the faith and the institution of the church. And that was pretty interesting. That emerged from their own history in their home country, which in this case was Ireland, where they experienced, in a way, the best of the faith and saw a human institution, the church, not always act in a way that was, for them, a way that was helping them to grow in their faith. And they were really challenged by that. But they were very faithful. The parish was the center of our lives. We went to Catholic school, and there weren't, they didn't share that internal struggle until we were older. I also learned from them, particularly from my father, and I'll tell you how, that faith was not simply a feeling, that faith involved reason, and that it was an intellectual as well as an emotional, emotionally engaging experience. And it was about ideas as well as trying to figure out how to deal with the big questions in life. It was about ideas. And it involved critical thinking. My dad, because of the conditions in his home country, was allowed to go to the 4th grade and believed that the single greatest gift he got coming to this country wasn't me, wasn't my mom, it was a library card. Because what it was a ticket to learn what they hadn't been allowed to know. And it was knowing their own history, what their experiences had been, that helped him to make sense. And it was also reading about the church and the church as an institution he felt that did enormous good despite the fact that the church is a human institution. And he did all of that reading in 2 Catholic journals, America and Commonweal. And in those days, his colleagues, you know, the families on the street where we lived, the factory workers in the factory where he worked, weren't talking about America and Commonweal. And we didn't have a subscription. There was a neighborhood copy of each of those that was passed around by the one woman in the neighborhood who had a college education. One person. And she subscribed and she passed it around the neighborhood. So what I heard him talking about was ideas and, in a sense, the best of the church. And the ideas were very much about social justice, not only, but very much. And the third arena where I learned a lot about faith was the tremendous concern that my parents had about issues of social justice. And in those days, it was particularly expressed in their concern about the labor movement. And there was a Jesuit in Boston, Mortimer Gavin, and I don't know, John, if that name rings a bell. It's probably way older than you remember. But he was the moderator of the Catholic Labor Guild. And there were local politicians and Catholic leaders, John Court, who had written for America and Commonweal for years, who lived in the neighborhood. And they had a little group, a Catholic labor group, that met every month. And my dad would go to that. He belonged to a union. And they understood in those days that it was the Catholic Church's support of the labor movement that saved their lives, that got them enough money that they could raise and feed a family, and that got them the working conditions that made it possible to live with dignity and work with dignity. And that was a pretty, that was like a theme that overrode a lot of, that was what social justice was about then, was the labor movement and workers having dignity. Like you, I grew up learning gradually that the world wasn't simply divided into the guys with the good hats, the white hats and the black hats, that there was good and evil. And in the beginning, that was really simple. There were good people and there were evil people. Or there were good things and evil things. And over time, like you, with development, we figured out it was much more complicated than that. And the other thrust, and the last one that I'll mention from my past that's relevant, is there was a sense in those days particularly, and it was a language we heard a lot in the church, and it was called worldliness, that there was a sense of this world and the next world. The world was not seen as a friendly place, and the church was the safe haven. So it was the church and the world. That distinction we live with much less. But I think I tell you those things because what you'll hear in my personal account of my research and what I'm doing at BC, those are the themes that kind of have informed where I eventually came to. The research that I do, pretty much, I'm a psychologist, so I'm interested in individuals and how they work, as are my students sitting here. That's what we try to explore. And particularly, the interest I have is looking at individuals who live in poverty and looking at the impact of poverty on the lives, particularly of children and families. And when I first came to BC in 1989, BC was enormously supportive of a study that I was doing then on the impact of homelessness on children. And I had a lot of support and liberty here to leave campus and go to local shelters and interview moms and kids, mostly in the shelters, to figure out what it was that this experience of putting people into shelters, into motels, what that was doing to the hearts and minds of kids particularly and their moms. And it was a pretty profound experience for me because what I learned was the enormous impact of poverty on the psyche of those families and kids. And what I listened to were stories where children would tell me why it was they wanted no one to know that they were homeless. In school, for example, they didn't want their teachers to know, they didn't want other kids to know, and part of the reason was they said, if people know that I'm homeless, they'll think I'm like the bag ladies that you see on TV. They'll think I'm like one of the drunks that is living in the park. And what homelessness, even at that young age, had done to them was really ground down their definition of themselves. Is they felt that they were less than other people because they were homeless. And they were trying to protect that. Like, I don't want my teacher to think I'm one of them. And that experience was pretty profound for me, listening to these stories that eventually ended up in a book called Moving to Nowhere. And that was the description a little child gave me, a 12-year-old boy, of what it felt like when his mother said to him, "We have to move to the shelter." I said, "What did you think when she said that?" He said, "I was scared, Mrs." I said, "Why were you scared?" He said, "I thought I was moving to nowhere." You know, when you lose your home, what's out there? Nowhere. And that was his construction. So that experience of research really motivated me to think about what can we do to dull the impact of poverty on kids, the extreme poverty, not even the poverty of money, but the poverty of spirit that many of these children experience. Children who feel like the homeless kids often felt, my mother couldn't take care of me. That's what mothers do, they take care of kids. My mother couldn't take care of me. And they'd come up with all these explanations for why that was. One little boy told me, he said, when my mother gets her check every month, she spends it on us right away. She buys us candy. And then at the end of the month, we don't have any money left. And it's really, what he was saying was, my mother loves me too much at the beginning of the month. And then in the end, there's nothing left. But what he was really saying was, the mother that should have protected me and taken care of me couldn't do it. So it led me to think about, and I did this with colleagues here at Boston College. It was just an incredible experience. We gathered faculty from across all the professional schools who were working with children or families living in poverty. We just invited them. We put out an invitation. We said, if you're doing this work, and some of them we could identify, we went school by school, we brought them together, and they would gather once a month. And we would figure out, because no one profession or no one discipline anymore can solve human problems. And psychology couldn't solve this, sociology couldn't solve this, theology couldn't solve this. It's how do we bring everybody together? And the professions that came together, the disciplines and the professions, were mostly those who were the doers, not so much the thinkers. In every university there are thinkers and doers. And it was mostly the doers. It was the law school, School of Social Work, sociology department, School of Nursing, School of Management, interestingly enough, and education and psychology. They came together to talk about, can we create some kind of intervention that will address the needs of children and families living in poverty? That was probably around 93. We decided it would make sense for a number of us across the professions to get some grant money to try to do something. And some of life is serendipity. It's things that happen that you are there when they happen. The law school, the social work school dean said, I know of a grant from a foundation that will give us some funds to train student teachers and student social workers in schools and teach them how to work together. And we applied for that and were successful, and at the same time wrote a grant to the federal government. It was called the FIPSI grant, to bring together all the professions over the course of 3 years and say, how can we work collaboratively to help schools figure out how to address the non-academic needs of kids and families that are coming to, the kids that are coming to school. How do we bring the resources of the law school to bear, of the nursing school, of our colleagues in sociology, economics? How do we bring everybody around the table to begin to formulate how to do this in schools? Because we knew schools were the one place where almost every kid came, and they were also a place where kids were there for a good part of the day. We also listened to teachers. We brought teachers to campus, and we said, tell us, what are the human problems that you see in the children that you're teaching that you can't solve, and that you think, if they were solved, would make these kids more able to learn and to thrive, really. And doing that in a Jesuit university, in a Catholic university, was a no-brainer. These faculty were so committed, and I'm by no stretch of the imagination saying you can't do it in other places. But in a Jesuit university, it was really easy because everybody understood the mission of Boston College. And so people wanted to do this work. So our first big opportunity, we got both of those grants. Then we had a chance to go for a grant, and at the time it was considered a lot of money, $300,000. And to a graduate student, it still is a lot of money. But to go for a grant that would allow us not just to think about how to solve these problems, but actually to do something, to go into a school with the folks from the law school, with the folks from the School of Social Work, nursing, psychology, education, to go into that school, and we worked with one school over in Alston, the Gardner School, and create a different kind of school. And the funder, which was, I don't know if you remember the Reader's Digest, they had a foundation called the Walsh Foundation, and they said, we will give this grant to a partnership between a local school, a university, and a community organization that knows how to work with kids and families. So we said, let's do it. and we talked to the community organizations that would be involved in some way with that school, and the YMCA emerged as one that really wanted to work with us. They had a director of the Y that was, he was like a poster child for social justice, and he was so committed to doing this. But the foundation said to us, look, the university people are going to have to write the grants. Don't think for 1 minute that, we used to call him the Y guy, that the Y guy has time or has enough experience doing this that he can afford to write a grant that's going to work for everybody. Don't think the principal of the school can write the grant. She's too busy. She's got almost 500 kids and no assistant principal, so she's not going to write the grant. We're charging the universities with the responsibility of pulling this whole thing together. We'll give you a planning grant for $50,000 for a year. Pull it all together and write this big proposal. And 9 universities were invited, 3 were going to get the grant. But here was the hitch. The foundation said, if you write this grant as a university, we will not give the university the money. The grant will go to the community agency. That's among the 3, the school, the university, and the community agency. The group that needs the power in this is the community agency. We're not going to put it in a university, and we're not going to put it in a school district, because we know what school districts do with grants. They use it for whatever they need to use it with, so to use it for. So we had to go to the president of Boston College and say, will you let us do this? And it took him about 6 seconds to think about this. He said, of course, this is a no-brainer. You do it. You use all the university resources you need to, use your time, get the staff involved, you do this work and engage it. And we did. And the great story is the person who ran that planning grant for us was a lawyer who had come back to the School of Theology. She came back to the pastoral ministry and then eventually got her doctorate in theology, and she's teaching now at Loyola. But she got it. And what was so great is we could use people from different backgrounds, use the skills and the strengths that they brought to bring that to bear on how to do this work. To make a very long story short, I'll cut to the chase. We eventually developed a way in schools to systematically address the non-academic needs of kids by assessing each child's needs, developing a tailored program, academic, social, emotional, family, and health, and say, we will go into the community, we'll find those services and resources and enrichments that each child needs. They're different for every child. We'll come up with a plan, we'll follow up, we'll make sure the child eventually gets to the services. We're not just going to say, here, go to the local after-school program, here, go to an arts program down at the museum. We'll make sure the child gets there, we'll track it, we'll follow it up, and then what we'll do is we'll measure the outcomes. We'll say, did any of this make a difference in the academic achievement of these kids? And now, 15 years later, we're at it. We've figured out how to do it. It takes a long time. And more critically, we're getting wonderful outcomes. We can show in schools where you put this, kids do better on test scores, kids do better on report cards, I mean statistically better. Kids do better on measures of classroom behavior, they do better on measures of motivation, and they do better on, help me guys, effort. They do better on, it's like the Avis, they try harder. And that the effects are particularly profound for kids who are English language learners. They're significant for all kids, but they're particularly profound for English language learners. We're in 13 Boston schools right now, and we're in 14 Catholic schools. Our data primarily is from the public school sample because that's where it's easiest to get the data. We're in the process of expanding this across the state. We've been asked by the State Department of Ed to go into all of the failing elementary schools next year, and that's a pretty enormous task, as you might imagine. The failure of these schools is not just teachers who don't do their job. There are a few of those, but the failure of these schools is the result of the poverty in the lives of those kids. Kids that come to school inadequately housed, inadequately cared for, hungry, beaten down by community violence, kids that come in the morning and say, there was a guy shot in my alley last night, and my mother went out to see it. She wouldn't let me see, but I looked out the window and I could see the blood. He's going to sit down and do reading that in the morning. And this is not the unusual. I'm not, pulling the stories here to say, here's the dramatic. Life in the city is tough, really tough. And so we found a way, we think, that makes a difference for these kids. So how do I connect all this with where I come from as a Catholic woman? And how do I connect it to my Christian faith? And I want to say at the outset, this is how I make meaning out of it, but all of my graduate work was done primarily with faculty who were not Catholic or Christian, who were Jewish. And I learned enormous things from them. They have a little bit different way to make meaning out of it, but they have a way to make meaning, and it's tremendously important. And so we shared the same values, but we didn't share the same faith. And I think that's a really important point. But one of the things that motivates me, obviously, is, in terms of the content, is the responsibility that I feel we have as Christians to enhance the human condition. That's the first line in the Lynch School mission, to enhance the human condition, expand the human imagination, and make the world more just. I think that's, at least I felt, a real motivating belief for me. Another way to say that is to relieve the suffering of the world. If we're enhancing the human condition, we're relieving the suffering. And I know there are some theology students in the room, and you might know David Tracy, but he has a great line. I said I'd share some of my inspirational places. He says, if God is only this abstract question that doesn't respond directly to what human beings are going through, then I don't see why we would pay that much attention. In other words, God cares. And then he says, doing something about it, the struggle for justice, and to clarify what that means in relationship to God and Christ, has become for me an overwhelming focus. Now, I'm not recommending that you pick up Tracy and start reading him if you're not theologians, but it's a pretty simple statement of what it means to engage in, at least for me, to engage in research that's related to the human condition. In theology, in the Gospels, it's called the preferential option for the poor. I do not, by any stretch of the imagination, think that everyone's research has to be with people living in poverty at all. But it just happens to be what pushes me. We believe as Catholics that we're a community and not a collection of individuals, and so we're responsible for each other. So we're responsible for those who are poor, and it's not, you don't take them or leave them. And I don't know if you know Mark Shields, the TV commentator, who's was interviewed about 5 years ago by Ray Schroth, a Jesuit, and Shields, I'm sure you'd recognize him if I pass this around, but this is one of the things in the bottom of my pile that I read every once in a while to motivate me. He says, he's answering the interviewer, Schroth, as one who was born a Democrat and baptized a Catholic, and I know we're not all Democrats, and we may not even be all Catholics in this room, but this is where he comes from. I believe that the Catholic in the public square, which to me is a profoundly moving image, the Catholic in the public square, we're out there with our sleeves rolled up, with our hip boots on, in the middle of the public square. As a journalist or a politician or a citizen, has no better guide than the Gospel of Matthew. The origin of much of our debate and differences springs from the tension between the Judeo-Catholic ethic of community and the more American habit of lionizing or romanticizing individualism. Now, they're both goods. It's just... And then he contrasts, for him the contrast, since he's a political commentator, the contrast is between Reagan and Roosevelt, to make his example. He says, the Gipper asked, Reagan, the Gipper asked, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? FDR, Roosevelt, put it differently. The measure of our progress is not whether we add more to the abundance of those who already have much, but whether we provide enough for those who have too little. And then this is the part of it that is just beautiful. He said, for the Catholic, I would say for the Christian, or I would say for the believer. I believe the question ought to be, are we better off? Are the strong among us more just? Are the weak among us more secure? And really, that to me is such a beautiful statement of what we're about in terms of our mission as Catholic Christian believers. My work is also grounded in the belief that scholarship and research are a profound expression of faith. And it's a way to acknowledge anybody's research. There are faculty in this university doing research on the tiniest of things, the nanotechnology folks. There are researchers that are doing research on language. Where's the student who's in linguistics? You know, looking at words and word meaning and where it came from. And all of that research is critically important. It is no less or more important than doing research about the impact of poverty. It's all critical. Why? Because it's about exploring the depths of creation. It's about exploring the world. And that's why, think back to what I said about the old polarity between the world and the otherworldly, you know, heaven and earth. The sky and the earth are connected. And in many, many ways, that's one of the cores of the Jesuit spirituality. The world is good. It's not a bad place. The things of the world are good things. Chardin, you know, the Jesuit anthropologist, I mean, he understood this at multiple layers. Gerard Manley Hopkins, the poet, the world is charged with the grandeur of God. You know, it's a good thing to be up to our necks in the world. And learning is not about doing good. We have a debate sometimes in the Lynch School because we're openly committed to social justice. But it's not about being a do-gooder. Is it important to do good? Of course. But you don't have to be in a university to do good. What's the role of the university? To develop knowledge, to create knowledge, to disseminate knowledge. That's what we're about. And if I wanted to do good and not create knowledge, not do research, not try to demonstrate, here's what we're learning about how this works and why this works, then I could do it with an office downtown. I could do it in a classroom, down in a public school. But my interest is digging away a little bit at the world and saying, how does this work? And knowledge is always to the good. We sit around the Lynch School in our project. The project is called Boston Connects. And we literally have had 3-hour debates with statisticians about something called an effect size. And an effect size is literally how significant is significant results. You got a significant result here, how significant is it? And they're debating 0.05, 0.20, and we can go for 3 hours. Do I think that's a worthy activity? Absolutely. Am I, at that moment, helping kids? In the scheme of things, yes. And it's critical to do that. If we're a university, we have to be about producing knowledge and disseminating it. But I think there's another piece of it, is that knowledge doesn't exist for its own sake. And in this university, Father Monin, who was the former president, used to always, in my memory, say when he gave a public address on the role of the university, that knowledge does not exist as an end in itself. It exists to better the human condition. We have a reason as believers to create knowledge, to disseminate knowledge. It's to make the world a better place. So it drives us all to learn. And what I'm really talking about here in terms of the doing good and the learning is really the relationship between thinking and doing. And in every one of your disciplines or professions, you run across that divide. The theologians, the folks in higher ed, the psychologists, it's the distinction between thinking and doing, and how we live in a church that values both. You know, faith is about reason, faith is also about action, and you need both. Yeats had a great quote, which also was at the bottom of my pile, but now it's in my head. Thinking without doing is meaningless. Doing without thinking is, no, thinking without doing is empty. Doing without thinking is meaningless. In a sense, you need to join thought and action. And our theology, if the theologians were up here, you could talk about that that's a critical piece. You can't just talk it. You have to walk it. And that's pretty moving to me personally. Doing this work, the work that I happen to be doing, inevitably leads us, we're a group now in the School of Ed doing this work, into the place where poverty lives. And for us, it lives in the cities. And the cities have always been part of the Jesuit tradition. That's in a way where they've always done their work, where they see their work being done. I don't know if you've ever come across somebody named John O'Malley, a Jesuit who's written the history of the Jesuits, but he talks about the city, and he's actually talked a lot about it in his writing. But he says, in talking about the city, the Jesuits were their first schools, were usually opened when they were requested by the city or by some of its citizens in some form or other, paid for by the city, and established to serve the families of the city. And the purpose of the schools in the early days of the Jesuit schools wasn't, as you might imagine, to teach theology and let the rest of the learning be done by somebody else. The purpose of the school was to teach citizens, to teach culture, to teach politics, to teach history. They were also interested in the formation of the person. You know, what you hear about at BC, the cura personalis. But really, they were about forming citizens to work for the common good. And they did it in the city. And there's a wonderful Jesuit. I had Amy, who's here, my graduate assistant, look this up yesterday. I think she thought I was losing a few marbles. But it was a talk given by the Jesuit Father General, Hans-Peter Kolvenbach, if any of you know about him. And he gave this talk actually at many universities across the country. I think it was in the 80s. But it was really about the Jesuits and the city. And he says in here, and we found this one, the University of Detroit had it on their website. But he said, similarly, during their 450-year history, the Jesuits have paid particular attention to city centers, the sites of intense cultural, economic, and political energy. In a way, the cities is where poverty lives, but they're also rich sources of life. The Portuguese companion of St. Ignatius, St. Francis Xavier, in founding the Society of Jesus, wrote about the Jesuits in 1538. This is what he wrote. They moved to another larger house in a more convenient location in Rome. Persuaded by Ignatius, they left their old residence, remote from the concourse and the traffic of people, and moved to the central part of the city, which was seen as a more appropriate place by for the ministries of the society. And then Kolvenbach said, as the Latin adage puts it, Bernardus Valles, Montes Benedictus, and it goes on. And what it means is, St. Bernard loved the valleys as St. Benedict loved the mountaintops. St. Francis loved the towns, but Ignatius preferred famous cities. And I think that's still true. You know, when the president said to us, you go get that grant, we'll live with the fact that that grant's not coming to Boston College. He understood the mission of the university to the city. And I think BC, more than any place I know, and I'm sure there are plenty of other places, but in my experience, BC has really lived out its role in the city. It gets it about the city. We never have to explain more than once why we need something from the university to help us to do the work in the city. They get it, and they support it. So these are my little motivators. At the end of the day, doing this type of work that we're doing has taught us a lot. You know, you learn when you're doing. What it's taught us is how much we still do not know. We've developed an intervention now in schools that seems to be making a real difference, addressing the non-academic needs of kids. We know far less about it and how it works than we know about it. We know that it works. Exactly how it works, we don't know. And hopefully that's the kinds of questions the next generation of psychologists will be asking. But there's far more unknown than there is known in this universe. So the more you know, the more you feel like, wow, my effort is so little and so puny in comparison to what we'd really love to know. And you also realize in doing this your own imperfections. Your research is flawed, it's not perfect, but you also figure out pretty quick you're flawed. Because you don't just want to do the justice, you want to be it to the extent that you can. And that's the hardest part of all. And that's the part that clearly Michael Buckley and Nicholas Lash, the theologians, get in terms of the work of theology. It's not just doing these things. It's about finding the place inside you that can live it. And that's the hardest part of all. The statistics are nothing, in my experience, compared to that. Is how do you actually be it and not just do it? And that's a pretty humbling experience when you realize how far you are away from that. And that brings me back to the final source of my inspiration, not the final source, but the final one I want to share with you tonight, and that is Yeats's lovely poem. I don't know if you're fans of Yeats, but the circus animal's desertion. And it's a 3 or 4 stanza poem, but it ends with, he talks about climbing back down the ladder of his heart, and it's about the end of his days. Finally, he said, I climb down to where all the ladders start, the place we all climb out of, the foul rag and bone shop of the heart. So in the end, what we realize is how imperfect we are, what a little bit we've done, but the only alternative is not doing it. Thanks.